Storyteller's Thread, a monthly podcast devoted to young adult literature and the art of storytelling. I'm your host, Sean Connors. On each episode, we invite an author for young adults to take us inside their work, and in doing so, to talk about their writing process, their inspiration for writing for young readers, and the general ins and outs of earning a living as a professional storyteller. So, whether you're a compulsive reader, an aspiring writer, a teacher or librarian, or simply a frustrated reader who's counting the hours until you get home and dive back into that novel that's waiting for you on your nightstand, this is the place for you. Hey everyone, it's March 1st, 2020, and we have much to celebrate this month. Not only have we begun the last leg of our march out of winter, did you see what I did there? But most of us are on the verge of advancing our clocks here in the United States, meaning that we'll see daylight longer in the very near future. Given the gray and rain we've had here in Arkansas this winter, believe me, spring cannot get here soon enough. I'm going to temper my opening comments for this month's show by acknowledging that comic book enthusiasts seemingly like nothing more than to argue the most arcane of points and details. So I understand that what I'm about to say is going to be hotly contested, but I'm okay with that. As a lifelong comic book reader, there are 3 graphic novels, or more precisely, graphic memoirs, that stand out in my mind as having played a pivotal role in changing how comics are perceived here in the U.S. First on my list is Maus, which recounts author Art Spiegelman's father's experiences as a Polish Jew during the Holocaust. Maus became the first graphic novel ever to win a Pulitzer Prize in 1992. In doing so, it not only challenged literary gatekeepers, by which I mean people like college English professors, publishers, and critics, to reevaluate the literary merit of comics, but it also helped to pave the way for comic books and graphic novels to enter cultural spaces like libraries and bookstores, something that was unheard of prior to that point. Second on my list is Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis, which offers readers a glimpse of life in Iran while examining Satrapi's experiences coming of age during and after the country's Islamic Revolution. Adapted into an Academy Award-nominated animated film, Persepolis was widely embraced by mainstream audiences, and like Maus, it helped normalize comics as a form of reading material. And that brings us to the third book on my list, American-Born Chinese, which was written by my guest this month, Gene Luen Yang. Published in 2006, American-Born Chinese used the medium of comics to comment on topics related to race and identity politics, and not surprisingly, it captured the attention of many school teachers and librarians. In doing so, it helped to create space in the high school literature curriculum for a mode of storytelling that, for much of its history, had been marginalized in school settings. The son of immigrant parents, Yang credits his father, an electrical engineer from Taiwan, and his mother, a programmer from Hong Kong, with having reinforced their Asian culture at home, and also with having kindled his affinity for stories and storytelling. After graduating high school, Yang attended the University of California, Berkeley, where he majored in computer science with a minor in creative writing. Although he initially found employment as a computer engineer, he eventually left his position after only 2 years to teach computer science at Bishop O'Dowd High School in Oakland, California. It was while working as a teacher that Yang wrote and drew American-Born Chinese, and the critical acclaim the book received forever changed his life. In 2006, American-Born Chinese became the first graphic novel ever to be nominated for a National Book Award. In 2007, it won the American Library Association's Michael L. Prins Award, an annual award that acknowledges the best book for teenagers based solely on its literary merit. In the years that followed, Yang continued to balance teaching with making comics, publishing books such as the critically acclaimed Boxers and Saints, his Avatar Last Airbender series, and his Secret Coder series, both of which are crazily popular with young readers. In 2016, The U.S. Library of Congress named Yang Ambassador for Young People's Literature. And in the same year, he became only the third graphic novelist to receive a MacArthur Fellowship, otherwise known as the Genius Grant. As you'll soon hear, Yang has since left teaching to focus on making comics full-time. Having written Superman and other titles for DC, he returns to independent comics this month with his latest graphic novel, Dragon Hoops, which chronicles his experience following the men's basketball team at Bishop O'Dowd, the high school where he taught, in its quest to win its first ever California state championship. I had the opportunity to talk with Gene about the appeal that comics hold for him as a mode of self-expression, the challenges that he faced writing Dragon Hoops, his first work of nonfiction, and a childhood dream that we both happen to share, but which, unfortunately for me, only he was lucky enough to realize. As it turns out, you and I share something in common. As children, we both dreamed of being either an animator for Disney Studios or a cartoonist. You, of course, followed your dream while I settled for the glamorous life of college professor, but that's a whole other story. As I was preparing for our conversation, though, I found myself thinking about my own childhood aspirations and how they were influenced by the fact that I had an artist mother who stayed home to raise my siblings and me, and who very often encouraged us to entertain ourselves by drawing and writing stories. What inspired your interest in art and storytelling? Do you remember?
Well, first, I do want to say that being a college professor is pretty awesome. You know, I was a high school teacher for a very long time. I taught high school computer science for 17 years, and I really loved it. It was actually a very difficult job for me to leave behind. But, you know, being a cartoonist is also awesome. I think I started becoming interested in stories when I was very young, also because of my parents. Both of my parents really loved to tell stories. And that was one of the primary ways that we used to interact with each other when I was young. So both my parents are immigrants. My mom was born in mainland China and my dad in Taiwan. I think they told me stories from the culture that they left to keep that connection alive. You know, I talked to some of my friends who are also children of immigrants, and that seems to be a pretty common thing. Parents will use stories as a way of building that connection between, you know, what used to be their homeland and the new generation. So I grew up with stories. I grew up, I think, maybe unconsciously understanding the importance of stories, that stories are a way of preserving culture. And when I started drawing, that's when I wanted to tell stories by drawing. I felt like these two things could go together pretty well. And that's where, you know, my ambition to become an animator and eventually a cartoonist came from.
So as you said, you did end up choosing a career in cartooning. And considering the trajectory your career's taken, I think it's probably fair to say that you made the right choice. What is it about the medium of comics that appeals to you as a mode of self-expression?
Yeah, I have to say my career's been kind of crazy. This has really been unexpected. You know, the response to a few of my books has just been, it's been nuts. It's been life-changing. I think one of the things that I love most about comics is this combination between words and pictures. So I have to tell you, like, I'm pretty mediocre as a writer, and I think I'm pretty mediocre as an artist. But in comics, I get to use both. So I can use one to kind of cover up my deficiencies for the other. You know, comics is one of the few art forms that really is two distinctive art forms mixed together. And I've loved that from the very beginning, from the very first comic that I bought when I was in 5th grade. I've loved it.
I came across a speech that you gave at the 2007 National Book Festival, in which you likened reading a well-done comic to reading a page out of somebody's diary. Can you talk about your reasoning behind that metaphor, or how you understand that to be the case?
Yeah, I think a well-made comic can be an incredibly intimate object, you know, because what you're seeing on the page is the actual movements of the creator, of the cartoonist behind that work. In a novel, you are reading the words of the writer, but you're not reading it in their handwriting for the most part, unless it's a very unique book, right? So there's something about that, I think. Seeing lines on a page drawn by another human being that can feel incredibly intimate. I actually think that that's why we're seeing a resurgence in memoir comics right now in America. So for a very long time, here in the United States, the dominant genre within comics was superheroes. I think there were great reasons for that. I think one of them is budget. If you want a story that has, aliens and spaceships and people in spandex in it flying around, it was way cheaper to draw that than to try to film that. And I also think that it was way more effective to draw that than to try to film that. Special effects technology just wasn't there. It wasn't convincing, But now I do think that superhero movies are as or more effective as superhero comics in conveying that wonder, that comes from those science fiction type of stories. So modern American comics have to lean on another strength of the medium. And in my opinion, that other strength is this intimacy. When you read a book like Smile by Raina Telgemeier, you are actually seeing the movement that her hand made on that page. And there's something very enthralling about that. You feel like you're really getting a glimpse into the author's life.
And almost a sense of immediacy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, and I think she does it particularly well. The way she uses her thought balloons, the way she chooses her words, I think it all serves to build this deep connection between her and her reader.
Now that I've set you up with some easy questions, let me ask you a big question. In that speech that I cited from the National Book Festival, you qualified that what you were describing was a well-done comic.
Yeah, that's right.
What is a well-done comic book, in your opinion?
I mean, just like any other medium, right? There are comics that are kind of terrible. And I've definitely made some of those for sure. But, and I think in the same way for other media, sometimes what makes something great and what makes something crappy is a little bit nebulous. It's a little bit hard to put your finger on. I think the same is true for comics. I do think there are some guidelines, though. I think a well-done comic has to be very conscious of the storytelling. And by that, I mean how things are paced out, how things are framed within each panel, the transitions between one panel and the next. I mean, on a very practical level, I think the lettering has to match the art in some way. It can't feel like two different things. It has to feel like a single organic whole. And I also think, especially with the more intimate comics, you really do have to tell your story in a smaller, more street level way. That's a really clunky way of describing it, but you know what I mean. Like you have to be very conscious of the point of view that you're choosing, and that point of view has to be a very relatable point of view.
As you're talking about what constitutes a good comic for you, sort of from these aesthetic design standpoints, I'm curious how you situate your own lineage in comics. Are there particular writers or artists that you regard as having influenced how you approach your work?
Yeah. When I grew up in the 80s, back then, most of the comics that were available in America were superhero comics. So I grew up mostly on superhero comics. But then as I got older, I think my reading habits diversified. So I would say that I'm pretty heavily influenced by Jeff Smith. I remember when Bone came out, it was a huge revelation to me. In a lot of those, not necessarily underground comics. I think I was a little bit young for that, but alternative comics that came after the underground comics, like the Hernandez brothers and Adrian Tomine. Adrian Tomine is actually younger than me, but he began making comics when he was in high school. And I remember reading my first Adrian Tomine comic, and it was like my first issue of Optic Nerve, and it was mind blowing. Linda Berry also. I think Linda Berry is one of those artists that is really able to create something incredibly intimate. When you are reading her comics, it really does feel like you are getting a glimpse into her life. More than a glimpse. You're getting a really good look at her life. And then I wasn't a fan of manga when I was a kid, but in college I started reading Osamu Tezuka, and his stuff really just blew my mind. So I'd consider him an influence as well.
I should point out we actually share another thing in common. I also taught high school. I taught high school English for 12 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
You're at a point now where you can focus on making comics full time. But for most of your career, you were writing and drawing graphic novels while you were teaching computer science classes at a Catholic high school in the Oakland area. As a former high school teacher, I completely understand what that means, and I would love to know how you managed to replicate yourself in order to pull that off. So that's, again, another conversation. But seriously, how did you balance what are really two full-time jobs?
Well, I just went really slow at my comics. I was working on American Born Chinese, which was my book that came out in 2006 while I was a full-time high school teacher. It took me 5 years to finish that book. And that book was, I don't know, maybe 200 something pages long. So if you look at the page rate per month, it was not very high. I would, do work after school. And sometimes I'd wake up early and I'd get maybe an hour in before I went in. And then I would also try to do a lot of work during winter breaks. And we had an Easter break because it was a Catholic school, and summers, but it was super slow. It was like crazy slow. And I remember the very first few years of teaching, I just couldn't do anything during the school year because, those first few years of teaching were just so hard. I was trying to establish my curriculum, and I think it just took 100% of my energy. But then, like from teaching, after a while, you get used to the culture of the school. The students kind of know who you are even before they take your class because you've been there for a little while. So they don't come in like trying to test you. And then you know what you're doing. You know what you're doing in your classroom. You set up your curriculum. And at that point, I was able to, carve out some time during my week to work on comics. But it wasn't a lot. I was going very slow.
I can imagine. On an episode of this podcast, I talked with Joe Kelly, who also writes comics for DC and Marvel, and we were talking about the challenges of aspiring to live a creative life with the reality of having to pay your bills and put food on a table. And I'm curious, were there strategies beyond just working more slowly? Were there things that you did to protect your time to be creative?
It was a constant fight. I mean, I feel like it's still a constant fight. I feel like I still have that struggle right now, even as a full-time cartoonist. I think there are just so many things that are competing for your time. You really have to just guard it. One thing that was really helpful when I first started comics, it was even before I began teaching. I was living with a group of college friends, and I remember just telling them that I was going to try to make this comic. I was aiming to make a 32-page comic in a year, right? And I told them I had this. I told them, I figured out what my goals should be every week. And I asked them, at the end of every week, just ask me how I did on my goals. And if I didn't hit them, I want you to make me feel bad about it. And they were so good at that. So I think, even after I moved out of that house, I had internalized a lot of those voices, and that kind of propelled me forward.
Because it's when you're working, forget two jobs. I mean, just the discipline that's required at showing up at your drawing board or your computer every day, I don't think people really appreciate. I mean, you can find a lot more reasons not to put in the work, I feel like, than to sit down and force yourself to do it.
Yeah. I just struggled with that today. I'm in the middle of a project, and I find myself constantly wanting to do other things. Like I want to go make myself another cup of tea, or I want to go clean out the sink. Like, I want to go clean out our sink today just to avoid the work,
Yeah.
I think it's a constant struggle.
I want to stay with this theme of your experiences as a creator. You've said in interviews that you've wrestled with feelings of self-doubt as a creator, which may surprise some people given the acclaim that your first graphic novel, American Born Chinese, garnered. Not only did it win the Printz Award, but it was the first graphic novel ever nominated for the National Book Award. How did you experience the book's success? Like, did that do anything to allay your self-doubt, or maybe to amplify it as you sat down to do your second project?
It definitely amplified it. I mean, the response to American Born Chinese was just completely, it felt like it had just dropped down from the heavens. It felt like it was completely out of nowhere. It was totally unexpected. At that point, I really made a decision that I was just going to teach for the rest of my life. and I was going to do comics as a hobby. I began comics in the 1990s, and back then, Marvel Comics had declared bankruptcy. I'd go to these conventions. I went to San Diego Con. I remember the very first San Diego Comic Con, which is the biggest comic book convention in America, right? I went there for the first time. It was in the mid 90s. And on Sunday, it felt like there were more exhibitors on the floor than there were attendees. You could get tickets, at the door, day of, which is completely different from how it is now. But back then, people just weren't paying attention to comics. And the comic book industry really felt like it was coming apart at the seams. So at that point, I was like, I like comics. I love comics. I want to make comics. Doesn't seem like I can make a real career at it. But I'm just going to do it on the side, and I'm going to teach school, full time. And then American Born Chinese happens. It kind of presents this opportunity for me to invest more of my time in comics. And that was totally unexpected. So the second book that I did after American Born Chinese, I did it as a collaboration with my good friend Tin Pham. I did the writing and he did the art. Part of the reason why I wanted to do a collaboration was because I was freaked out, because I was worried that, I just felt kind of frozen. I felt kind of frozen after the response that American Born Chinese got. So I thought, if I team up with a friend of mine, then he'll push me forward when I need to be pushed forward. So what happened with that book was actually, I wrote the script. We sent it into the editor. He liked it. And then Tin started drawing. And he was doing the pencils. I was doing the inks. And we went through the whole book. It was like 200 pages. We got to page, 190. It took us maybe 2 years to get there. We got to page 190. And then my editor calls and goes, I really hate to tell you this, but this book is just not working. I keep thinking that it's going to work on the next stage, and it never does. So I think we're going to have to scrap it. And it was devastating. And that was like, at that point, I was like, maybe American Born Chinese is the only book I'll ever be able to get out there. That's what I thought. But Tin was really good about it. We ended up just starting over from scratch. We redid the whole thing, and then it ended up being my third book from First Second Books after that. So my first one was American Born Chinese. The second one ended up being a book called Eternal Smile, which is a collaboration with another friend of mine named Derek Kirk Kim. And then the third one was Level Up. But that's how I wrestled with it. I was like, it was just like I got a friend to help me, and then we had to start over. That's how I dealt with that.
Is the self-doubt something you continue to deal with?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I have a theory that most artists have low self-esteem. And that's why we're not something else, right? Like if we had good self-esteem, we'd be like, politicians or something else.
Well, my goal for this podcast has been to talk with different creators about their complete body of work, and that was my intention coming in this interview. But then my advanced copy of your new graphic novel, Dragon Hoops, arrived, and after reading it in a single sitting, I should add, I threw my entire plan out the window so that we could talk about this book at length. And for the sake of transparency, I should tell you that I have a bias for basketball, having spent hours of my own childhood and teenage years on basketball courts. But that said, I think Dragon Hoops is as good as anything you've done up to this point in your career. I just so enjoyed this book. Before we talk about it, though, would you mind giving listeners just a general sense of what it's about?
Well, first, thank you for reading it. Dragon Hoops is my first nonfiction book. I followed a high school basketball team for the 2014-2015 season. It was actually the varsity men's team of the school that I was teaching at. So it's the varsity men's team of Bishop O'Dowd High School. And this is a book actually that I never imagined I would do because I was not a basketball guy growing up. I actually hated all sports because I was terrible at all of them, which is part of the reason why I got into comics, But early in that year, in the 2014-2015 school year, I was still a high school teacher. I heard a lot of talk about the varsity men's team on campus. And I had just finished a big project. I was sort of, I felt kind of lost. I wasn't sure what I was going to do next in terms of comics. And then as I started digging into the story of this basketball team, I realized that this was going to be my next project.
As a work of nonfiction, as you pointed out a moment ago, Dragon Hoops does constitute something of a departure from your earlier work. What was your experience tackling a work of nonfiction like?
I was really freaked out by it. I mean, this is the very first time that I've done nonfiction. And it ended up being a little bit of a memoir because I ended up being a character in it. So when I first proposed it to my publisher, I was imagining I was just going to focus on the coaches and the players. I was not expecting to put myself into it. And eventually, I felt like the way the book was going forced me to do that, you know? So I've always been freaked out by memoir. You know, I've always admired people like Raina Telgemeier and even Robert Crumb to some extent. You know, I don't connect super well with a lot of his work, but I do admire his willingness to be honest on the page, you know? And I always thought, man, I don't know if I could do that. I don't know if I could draw a comic about my life, in part because I wasn't sure if I was brave enough to do it, you know, brave enough to expose myself like that. And the other problem, I think, was I was freaked out about doing nonfiction as a comic. Early on in the project, when I started doing sketches of all the players and the coaches, I began to feel like I was lying. Like just the very act of cartooning was lying because I was already adding this layer of fiction on top of what I was actually seeing. And I think that's true for other media, right? Like when you do a documentary film, the way you cut stuff automatically adds this layer that isn't there if you're actually in the moment experiencing it. But cartooning felt even more removed from the reality. So I really struggled with that. I really, that was definitely something that I thought about a lot as I was working on it.
So in conducting research for the book, on one level, you're following this team and you're talking with the players, you're talking with the coaches.
Yeah.
You know, as you said, you didn't grow up around sports. As an outsider to the O'Dowd basketball program, was it difficult for you to build relationships with the players and coaches that permitted their feeling comfortable sharing intimate details from their lives with you?
I mean, it depended on the player or the coach. So I ended up becoming pretty good friends with the head coach, with Lou Ritchie, and he has a real interesting story. I do think some of that is just the way he is, the way he's built. He's actually an alum of Bishop O'Dowd, and Bishop O'Dowd, when he was going there, he went there in the 80s, was kind of known as the school where all the rich white kids from the Oakland Hills went. You know, so he's African American. When he was there as a student, he was one of very few African Americans on campus. So the school has become much more diverse since then. But I think that experience really informs how he approaches community and how he approaches life. So he always tries to make people feel comfortable, and he always tries to make people feel welcome. So that was certainly true for me. You know, anytime I wanted to ask him a question, he was up for answering it. But then, like when I started interviewing some of the players, I think some of them were a little bit more guarded than others, and for really good reasons. You know, I was an adult. I'm a teacher. You know, they're teenage boys. So for some of them, I had to kind of figure that out narratively. Like, how was I going to deal with, you know, some of that narratively? And for other players, they were like really open to me. You know, I had one of the players on the team was actually in my computer programming class. So we got to know each other pretty well. You know, I'm still in touch with him. We still text each other every now and then. And so like he was taking my class during the first half of their season. So we would be flying on a plane to a tournament, and I would be giving him practice problems to help him prepare for the next test in my class. You know, so we got to know each other pretty well. But for other players, I didn't have that same kind of connection because I never had them in class. So I felt like I did have to navigate that throughout the book.
So I want to stay on that theme. Throughout your career, you've used your books to disrupt one-dimensional narratives about people, especially about people of Asian descent. With that in mind, in Dragon Hoops, you're very candid at times about the challenges that you faced in regard to representation. Just as an example, over the course of the story, readers get to see your character struggle with his desire for two of O'Dowd's best players, both of whom are African American, to share their stories about growing up in Oakland But at the same time, you're balancing that with what I sense is this desire to avoid problematic narratives about young black men. Can you talk about how you approached representing the people that you were writing about in a manner that was respectful, but also honest?
Yeah, I felt like that was really hard. I was kind of freaked out about that.
Well, you're very open throughout the book that was, in fact, a struggle for you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that was one of the reasons why I felt like I had to put myself in the book. You know, I felt like I had all of these weaknesses as a storyteller, as somebody who wanted to tell a story about basketball. I'd never played basketball before. I did not share a lot in common with some of the players on that team, and I just felt like I had to be real about that. And the best way to be real about that was to just put myself in as a character. So, so you're talking about Ivan Rabb and Paris Austin. There were, I'd heard from some of the coaches and some of the other players about their backgrounds. They actually grew up in the flatlands of Oakland, and I felt like I couldn't put any of that stuff in unless they shared it with me. So I did try asking them about it. And Ivan especially seemed very reluctant to talk about that. Like, he was really open to talking about anything that was happening on the court or in the school. But whenever I asked him about his childhood, he kind of deflected, And I also felt really weird about pushing too hard. I think if I was a journalist, maybe I would have, but I'm not a journalist at all. And I was a teacher on that campus, and it just felt really weird to push, to push somewhere where he didn't want to go. And as Ivan is he's such a great kid. He's like, there are TV cameras on campus all the time wanting to interview him, because at the end of his junior year, he was actually ESPN's #1 ranked recruit for his class. And the way he conducted himself, the way he presented himself, even the way he walked in the halls of that campus, you wouldn't be able to tell. He had like this inherent softness to him, or like an inherent gentleness and humility to him. And it really felt like he was two different people. It felt like he was one way in the hallways and when you're talking to him face to face, and he was like a really different way when he was on the court. Like, when he played, he was super aggressive. I mean, he was like a monster. He was like a monster on the court. He was so good. But when I was like talking to him in person, it felt bad to me to try to push past that gentleness. It felt like I wasn't doing the right thing. And I don't think I was able to articulate it until later in the season, like why it felt bad.
And there's even a scene where you and your wife are doing the dishes, I think, and you're talking about the issue that you and I are talking about. And there's a moment where your wife says to you, "Have you considered that maybe it's none of your business to dig into those things?"
Yeah.
And you're like, "But what do I do with the backstory? How do I get the backstory?"
Yeah. Yeah, that was based on, I actually had multiple conversations like that with my wife. So that was all put together into one scene.
I would just want to keep pushing on this, because there's just so many interesting things to talk about with this book. You have just an incredible talent. You've had an incredible talent for layering stories, and that is on full display in Dragon Hoops. On one level, the book is the story of the Bishop O'Dowd basketball team's quest to win its first California State Championship. At the same time, you're digging into the history of the game of basketball. But then there's this third layer, which takes the form of a meta-narrative, and which involves your continually calling attention to the presence of your hand in shaping this story. So to give people who are listening a sense of what I'm talking about, throughout the book, you'll show yourself often in the background holding the phone that you used to collect interviews, or we might see you jotting notes, or there are scenes where we see you watching games that you missed. There's also a scene where a player on the O'Dowd team who identifies as Punjabi tells your character that he saw these sketches that you'd posted of the team on Tumblr, and he asks you, could you change how you've drawn my hair? And your character explains that you drew his hair the way you did to help readers infer that he's Punjabi and not African American. And as their conversation's unfolding, like, we're seeing his hair change from one panel to the next. Can you talk about your rationale for what struck me as you're attempting to continually call attention to the book's constructedness?
Yeah, a lot of that came out of what I felt like were my weaknesses as a storyteller for this particular story. But I think my biggest strength is that I was a teacher at that school. I was connected to the community, and I think that was like that felt like the foundation of my, I don't know. I don't want to like right to tell the story. I don't know if that's the right word, but I just felt like I had all of these blind spots. And in the beginning, when I was trying to keep myself out of that narrative, it just didn't seem right. It didn't seem like it was flowing right. And I think looking back, the reason why is I was trying to go after this, you know, elusive, objective viewpoint, and there was just no way I was going to get there. Because of all my blind spots, because of all of my lack of understanding about a lot of different things about this. I just couldn't get there. So I felt like I had to put myself in as a character. And I was going through doubts about the book. I was like, is this really going to work? Am I really going to actually be able to pull this book off? And I was freaked out about how the season would end. And I think in the end, I just felt like the way to get through all that is just to put all of that anxiety on the page and to just be very, very honest about it. With the historical part, in the beginning, I was reading books about basketball history just to get to know that sport. It felt like homework that I was doing to kind of earn my voice for this basketball story. But then I started seeing these resonances between what I was reading and what I was seeing on the court as I was following this team. And I just thought, like, knowing certain stories from basketball history makes my viewing experience way more richer. Makes the way I interpret this game way richer. And I just felt like I had to include that in the narrative. And part of that is because I didn't understand the game of basketball that well. Like, even now, when I watch a game of basketball, there'll be these times when everything stops on the court. Like, there's a foul call, and I don't understand what that foul is. So I was really like, what drew me to each game, what really clicked in my head for each game was kind of like how I could see the connections between what I had read about in the past and what was actually happening in front of me right now. That kind of was what excited me the most.
On the surface, Dragon Hoops does initially seem like it would be a different project for you, but in fact, that's not the case. Throughout the book, you use the game of basketball as a vehicle to explore cultural topics that you've explored in other books, like racism and sexism and immigration. Did you know going into this project that was going to be the case, or did your interest in that interface between basketball and cultural topics evolve over time as you were working on the book?
In the beginning, I was really just aiming to tell a book about that team. What clicked for me at the very beginning was just Lou's story. I thought when he told me what happened when he was in high school, and that was the chapter 1 in the book, at first I thought he was lying to me because it felt like it was made for a movie. And then he gives me the tape of that game that he played when he was a junior in high school, and I went home and watched it. I was like, oh, he's not lying. This is real. This is really, really kind of crazy. So that's kind of what drew me in. But then as I was reading about basketball history and as I was following the team, I think that kind of stuff it felt like it was highlighting itself all around me. Like one of the games happened immediately after the Ferguson decision was announced, and I felt like I saw, I talked to Coach Lou about it afterwards. I could see the way that decision affected the team and that game. I mean, it even affected really practical things like the traffic. So I had to drive. It was an away game. I had to drive there. That drive normally takes an hour. It took me 2 hours to get there. So it was just like Ferguson was baked into the environment of that game, even if people didn't want it to be. I think when we got to that game, within that, like, there was no mention of it within the gym. It was like nobody wanted to bring it up. People just wanted to enjoy a game. But then it just felt like it affected everything that happened that night. It sort of colored everything that happened that night. So it just seemed like it came up again and again. And also with two of the players, especially, So there was that Punjabi player, Jeevan, that you mentioned, and there was also a Chinese exchange student. It just felt like race and culture were baked into their backstories. It really there's this interface between sports and their culture that was just apparent all the time.
Well, and as it turns out, the history of basketball, much like the history of baseball, reflects both the best and the worst of America. On the one hand, you examine how the history of the game mirrors the fight for social change over time, but you also call attention to the sport's complicity in perpetuating problems like racism and sexism. Can you talk about your interest in exploring that tension over the course of the book?
Yeah, I think that that's just a topic that I've returned to again and again in comics. And some of that is probably rooted in childhood for me. But when I was reading about basketball, it just kept popping up, like the founding of the NBA. Race was a huge part of the founding of the NBA. And even like early barnstorming teams, the way they attracted audiences was often by emphasizing the race to the point of stereotype. So it just felt like it was all over. And then even the popularity of that game. So basketball was constructed to be an indoor game, but really it became popular with communities that were on the fringes of American society, communities that were too poor to afford to maintain a field of grass. They couldn't gather together the resources to put together a baseball diamond. So what do they do instead? They put up a hoop somewhere and they play on concrete. They get a ball and they play on concrete. So it really felt like from the very beginning, basketball was kind of it was a game for outsiders. It was a game that was embraced by immigrant Catholic and Jewish communities. It was a game that was embraced by African American communities. It was just this, like, just because of the way it was structured, outsiders gravitated towards it.
What's something you learned about the sport of basketball in the course of doing your research into the game's history that surprised you?
I think everything surprised me because I barely knew anything. I barely knew anything. One of the big ones, I guess, was its history with China. You know, I knew going in, I was vaguely aware of Yao Ming and I was definitely aware of Jeremy Lin. I knew going in that basketball was incredibly popular in China, that it was, I think, the fastest growing sport in China. But I didn't realize how deep that history was. Basketball was introduced to China maybe a year or two after it was invented. So Chinese basketball is almost as old as American basketball. And it also occupies this strange place in Chinese culture where, during the Communist Revolution is one of the few elements of Western culture that Mao allowed to stay. So why is that? It's such a weird thing. They kicked everything else out. Why did they keep basketball? So all of that really intrigued me, and I wanted to read more about it as it came up.
And we see that today in North Korea,
Yes.
with the exclusion of all things Western, and yet Kim is a diehard basketball fan.
Yeah. Yeah. Dennis Rodman is like the American,
Right.
almost like the American ambassador to North Korea.
Yeah.
Why? That's so weird, right?
Yeah, I found myself thinking about that. I'm going to tell you, you mentioned everything you learned surprised you because you didn't grow up in the game. But as I mentioned, I grew up playing the sport, and I was equally just astounded at how little I knew about it. I think that one of my favorite stories in the book is the story you tell about Senda Berenson.
Mm.
Would you mind giving people a sense of who she is and what she contributes to the game of basketball?
So Senda Berenson was a Russian immigrant, and she was also a PE teacher. She was the one that adapted the rules of basketball that James Naismith came up with for women. So back then, there were lots of ideas. I mean, I guess there still are. There's still lots of ideas about women's physiology. But back then, they were really intense. And some of the ideas were, women shouldn't run too hard. They shouldn't scowl when they're playing. They shouldn't do all of these things because all these different things they have to do in competitive sports would make women unwomanly. And she came up with basically a compromised version of basketball for women to play that became very popular. And I feel like her legacy is very mixed, right? It's like it feels like in one sense, without her, maybe women wouldn't be playing basketball at all. But in another sense, she kind of, to get where she wanted to go, she really had to make all these really deep compromises. And in some ways, you could argue that early women's basketball kind of lost the soul of what basketball was actually supposed to be about. And women players and coaches from Senda Berenson on had the project of removing those restrictions and pulling the soul back in.
Well, and I should point out, you refer to the time when she adapts the game for women. That was not long after Naismith introduced the game.
No.
In the same way that the Chinese were quick to embrace it.
That's right.
And that astounded me. And you talk about the ways in which she made compromises to do that work, right? Women couldn't dribble more than 3 times or it would be a turnover.
Yep.
Or that women weren't trusted to run the length of the court due to their fragility. And what's amazing to me is that these rules didn't change until relatively recently. I think the dribbling rule was changed in 1966, and the women were allowed to begin to run the full length of the court only in 1971. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah, that's crazy. I think it was shocking. It was shocking to me to read all that stuff. A lot of that came from a book called From Fragility to the Final Four, and it's just a collection of essays about women's basketball. So they had a great one in there about Senda Berenson, and then they also had a timeline in the back about when all this stuff was introduced, or was not even introduced, was repealed, when all those restrictions were repealed.
I just find that whole thing amazing. I want to change gears here for a moment. During the season that you followed the O'Dowd basketball team, DC Comics reached out to you with an offer to write Superman. And you unexpectedly found yourself facing this decision of whether to leave teaching and devote yourself to making comics full-time or not. Can you take me back to that moment? What was it like for you to be facing that decision?
Oh, it was crazy. That was a crazy phone call from my agent. The very first comic in my collection was a Superman comic. So to go from that to being offered the chance to write the official monthly Superman comic was just it was astounding. It was astounding. So that was actually the 3rd time that DC had approached me. So they had approached me twice before that with smaller projects, and I'd always said no because I knew that it meant that I would have to leave teaching. But then they offer Superman, and I'm like, how do you say no to Superman? How can if you're like a superhero nerd, how can you say no to the opportunity to write Superman? So in the end, I had to say yes. But I will have to say though, at the time, I was also dealing with. I mean, I still am, I guess, but I was dealing with a lot of fear. I was dealing, I have 4 kids. I was freaked out, and then the contract that DC Comics offered was a 10-month contract. It was basically 10 issues, and I was like, am I really going to leave my teaching job? Am I going to leave this community that I love? All these, teacher friends that I had that I eat lunch with. Am I really going to leave that for a 10-month contract? So I do think that following that team, I don't know if I would have left had I not been following that team. Following that team convinced me that sometimes you just got to take that step. Even if you don't know what the outcome is going to be, you just got to do it.
You work that beautifully into the story. I was going to say the visual motif where periodically you'll zoom in on a person's foot in a panel and we see them take that step. And initially, it was like, what's going on here? But then as the story's unfolding and you're starting to piece together that this is very much about crossing boundaries and facing fears.
Well, thank you. Yeah. See, I mean, it's been great. I've actually been working for DC continuously since I left, so it's been about 5 years now. My most recent project is a Superman project. It's called Superman Smashes the Klan, and it's actually going to be out 2 months after Dragon Hoops. So it's sort of like I feel like they're kind of tied together. Like the decisions that I made in Dragon Hoops eventually led to Superman Smashes the Klan.
Yeah, as you said, I mean, since that initial run on Superman, you've done the stories for the DC Rebirth series about a Chinese teenager who's transformed into China's Superman.
Yeah, that's right.
And as you mentioned, you have this graphic novel coming out in which Superman takes on the Klan. How would you compare the experience of writing mainstream superhero comics to working on your own independent projects?
Well, they're both really fun, but they are fun in different ways. So when you're working in somebody else's universe, like a long established universe like the DC universe, it really does feel like you're playing with somebody else's toys. You can't just do anything you want with them. And there is this continuity that you have to respect. There's a tradition that you have to respect. Whereas when I'm working on my own stuff, I feel like I can kind of do whatever I want. The benefit, though, of using continuity that's already there is you can, I mean, there's certain things that are already established that you can use without really putting much, like you're not starting at ground zero with your readers, right? So for instance, like writers sometimes talk about endowed objects. So there are certain objects within a story that might be endowed with meaning, and usually what you'll have to do as a writer is you'll have to put some work into endowing that object. You'll have to build that object up within your narrative, and then eventually you'll have a payoff. But when you're working in DC Comics, when you're working in the DC universe, a lot of those objects are already endowed, and you can just use them. Like Aquaman's Triton or a Green Lantern ring. Like as soon as you show a Green Lantern ring in a DC comic, people know what that means.
On the flip side, I've always wondered, Superman's a fantastic example because he's the early superhero. And we have these stories about Superman that go back to the late 1930s, not just in one comic book, but we have multiple comic books coming out on a monthly basis from then through today. So you inherit this enormous continuity of stories. Is that intimidating? Like I've always thought, like how do you tell a story with a character who's really no one person can know all the stories that have been written about him?
Yeah. That was hard. That was hard for sure. Like the first few conversations that I had with my DC editor right after I signed on to do the monthly Superman comic was this. It was like me pitching an idea and him going, "Oh, we did that 3 years ago." And then me pitching another idea and goes, "Oh, that sounds like something we did 6 months ago." And then me pitching another idea and they go, "Oh, that sounds like something we did 5 years ago." So
Yeah.
when you have a character that's been around that long, almost everything has been done with him before. And I think ultimately what I found, I do think I struggled with Superman for a little while to figure it out. And I think ultimately what I found is I had to figure out where the overlap is between Superman and everything that's been established about him, and and kind of what my concerns are as a writer and as a storyteller.
I'd asked you about this experience of writing the mainstream comics as opposed to your independent projects. Do you find that the two experiences require different things of you as a writer? Has writing the superhero comics maybe expanded your writerly toolkit in any way?
Yes, I do think that they require different kinds of skills for sure. I think with the books that I do for First Second, I could return to that whatever narrative I'm trying to build over and over and over again, to try to find all the different facets that I can find. Whereas with monthly superhero comics, things happen so quickly that you don't get that marinating time. You kind of just have to go with the flow. A lot of times with superhero comics, things that happen in the universe in other people's books will affect your book at the last minute. So sometimes, you even have to kind of troubleshoot on the fly where, the book has sometimes even been penciled and you have to figure out a solution so that it doesn't conflict with something else that's happening somewhere else in the universe. So it feels very different. Like I'd say the books that I've done with First Second have felt slower. The process has felt much slower and maybe even deeper. And then the books that I've done for DC Comics feel like they're much quicker and much more, I don't know, flexible.
Do you struggle with that monthly deadline?
Sometimes I do. I feel like right now I'm working with a great editorial team at DC Comics, and it's been fun. And I do think a lot of times my editorial team kind of acts as an umbrella shielding me from the worst of the universe craziness.
You mentioned that you have the new graphic novel Superman Smashes the Klan. Can you give maybe people who are listening just a general sense of what that's going to be like or what it's going to involve?
My Superman Smashes the Klan experience has kind of been a hybrid because it's part of DC Comics' Young Readers line, which it's not monthly. They're basically putting out graphic novels, but they're putting it out with a superhero, like a comics industry sensibility. So it's definitely faster. It feels definitely a lot faster than with my first, second books, but it is not at the breakneck pace of doing a monthly comic. So Superman Smashes the Klan is actually a retelling of one of the most famous storylines in the Superman mythos. In 1946, on the Superman radio show, right after World War II, the writers had this debate about who Superman should fight next. He'd spent the entirety of World War II fighting all these Nazi villains on that radio show, right? And now that the Nazis were defeated in real life, they were like, we can't keep having them fight them on the radio show. So nobody really knows who came up with the idea. It might be Stetson Kennedy, who was a journalist at the time. It might be Bob Maxwell, who was in charge of the licensing arm, the Superman licensing arm for DC. But somebody came up with this idea that Superman should go up against the Ku Klux Klan because the Klan was the biggest threat to American peace at the time. So they did it. They actually did it. It came with a bunch of risks, because back then the Klan in certain communities had a reputation for being not a terrorist organization, but a community organization. So they knew that if they did this, they would get some pushback. But they did it anyways. In June of 1946, they began this 16-episode storyline called The Clan of the Fiery Cross. In this storyline, a Chinese-American family moves into Metropolis. A group of hooded racists come out. They burn a wooden cross on this family's lawn. And then Superman comes out to defend this family, right? And that, after that aired, they got death threats. They got calls for boycott. But they also got a soaring listenership. People really liked it. And by the end of that storyline, the listenership of the Superman radio show had grown significantly. And not only that, the membership of the Klan had actually also shrunk. So supposedly, after being portrayed as these bumbling bigots on a children's radio show, people just didn't want to join the Klan anymore. So it's one of the examples that we have of stories that we tell about people dressed up in spandex and capes actually affecting our real world. This story, considered one of the most important in the Superman mythos, has never been adapted to comics. And since, comics is Superman's native art form, native medium, I felt like we should do it. So I proposed it to DC Comics. They were really enthusiastic about it. They paired me up with Gurihiru, who was my first choice. We had done a bunch of Avatar: Last Airbender comics together, and we've done it. So we've adapted it. It's out in issues right now in 3 issues. It's a 3-issue miniseries, but the whole thing will be collected this May.
And then what's next for you? Are there projects that you're working on that you can talk about, or are you planning to take a long hiatus now that you finished a 400-plus page graphic novel?
Yeah, I'm in a little bit of a weird spot right now. So at the beginning of Dragon Hoops, I was in the spot where I wasn't totally sure what I was going to be doing next. And I'm kind of in that spot right now as well. So a couple things have landed. I mean, one thing I'm definitely doing is The Terrifics, which is a monthly comic from DC. It's about Mr. Terrific and this team of superheroes. They're kind of like the Fantastic Four of the DC universe. But I just started working on another project that hasn't been announced yet. But it'll hopefully be announced soon.
Well, I really appreciate you making time for me. And honestly, people who are listening, you need to go out and get your hands on everything that Gene has done, because it's fantastic stuff. It's thought-provoking stuff, and it's amazing. I mean, the conversations it inspires. So thank you for taking time.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Sean. It was really a pleasure. Thank you so much.
That's our show for this month. Thanks for being here, and thanks also for supporting this podcast. Even if you're not a basketball fan, definitely do yourself a favor and check out Gene's new graphic novel, Dragon Hoops, which comes out in bookstores on March 17th. If you couldn't tell from our conversation, it'll give you plenty to think about. As always, I'll look forward to seeing you back here next month when we'll continue to talk with young adult authors about the craft of storytelling. Till then, happy reading! Cheers.